may you allow me to share my presentation? That would probably make it easier to follow.
Yes, Doctor, you can share your screen now.
But I don't see yet the...
There would be a...
Okay, yeah. Now I see. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, dear brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, dear professors. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have a big spot for IIUM and Dato Jamil and other brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia. So, yeah, I had to accept this, and I'm really glad and pleased to be with you today. However, the challenge is quite some challenge to introduce four major terms and concepts in modern humanities and social sciences. Each of the four terms or concepts is a topic on its own. But, you know, one lesson I learned at IIUM is that how do you make a problem look smaller than it is by not even touching it, you know? So you just make a bigger problem next to it. So I decided to be even more ambitious than Dr. Jamil, and I am going to add a few more concepts like decolonization, postmodernism, and hopefully what we have in front of us will then look more manageable. So without taking any more time on introductions, I would wish to know, by the way, who you are and where you come from and join us from, but well, there is no time for that, especially given your numbers. So let's go straight to the imperialism. Imperialism is one way. There are many ways of defining it, and we can, in the discussion, we can see and jointly explore various utilization of the concept, but it's often defined as a state policy, practice, or advocacy, could be anything, of extending power and domination. It's basically being, you know, aggressive to others, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of other areas. So it doesn't have to be direct territorial control. It can be through other forms of power. Because it always involves the use of power, military or some other form of it, subtler, imperialism has often been considered as morally reprehensible. Now, this hasn't always been the case. You know, today when we say imperialism, we immediately, it's a pejorative, you know, term today. Why? Because the background is, or the backdrop is, that peoples have this fundamental right to self-determination. We will come back to that later as well. So every people, every nation has the right to its own nation state. For somebody to come and try to control, to impose its own dominion or hegemony over other peoples is aggression and is morally and politically unacceptable. So this is the background. What are the reasons for or causes for imperialism? In the literature you find many. You know, it could be economic interests, it could be simply human aggressiveness and greed, it could be search for security, it could be drive for power and prestige. You know, Napoleon had no other reason to go to Egypt except, you know, to show his power and for the prestige of French nation. Even humanitarianism sometimes is, you know, way of being imperialist. Anyway, these causes are present, have been present throughout the history, and you know of many empires. We have so many other things to say, so I'm really making this one particularly short. In China, in India, in Europe, in the Muslim world, there have been so many, and of course in modern Europe, there have been so many empires. And the causes that were behind their establishment are still there. The difference now is that international law is trying to, differentiate between what are the legitimate aspiration of nations for expansion and grandeur and so on, and illegitimate ones, and to grant the right for the legitimate and to contain the illegitimate ones. Now, how imperialism looked like in reality, this is just one example. This is a local king from Ghana. After being defeated, he and his mother are humiliated by having to do this to the colonial British officers. Okay, what do British officers have to do with Ghana in the 19th century? Of course, is the question of imperialism, simply the will to control other people, to expand the power. Now, the best known, at least to our generation, the best known edition, if you like, of imperialism is Western colonialism, which is defined as a political economic phenomenon whereby European nations explored, conquered, settled, and exploited large areas of the world. That started about 1500, and you come from a region where one of the first colonies of Western colonialism or imperialism happened to be, which is Malacca, right? 1511. There have been before that few colonies in North Africa by Spaniards. By the way, the European nations that did most of the colonization were Portuguese, Spaniards, Dutch, French, and English. Of course, Germans joined, Belgians joined at the end, but the main five nations are these. The Western colonialism peaked some in the years after the First World War, after the disintegration of Ottoman Empire or Ottoman state, when France, England, and other European countries controlled almost all of the world. There were very few non-European territories that were independent, that were not controlled by these European countries. Japan is one, Thailand is another, but Thailand itself was a regional empire. So Hijaz was not colonized. Turks succeeded in defending, small parts of Asia Minor, and so on. The impact, and this is what concerns us most, of course, you could, there is so much on the internet these days. I mean, you don't need a prof to tell you. What I am trying to achieve here is just to direct you to some of the most interesting aspects of colonialism to us. You will see now where I am going. Now, very briefly on the colonialism, it had a devastating and lasting impact on the colonized. If you just want to, for instance, have a quick look at the lasting impact or the legacy of colonialism on modern Muslim states, just have a look at the chapter written by Sayyid Wali Reza Nasser in Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam. It's a lengthy chapter, but it is worth reading. It tells you how the boundaries, how the ideology, how the social strata, how economies, how institutions, including how militaries in the Muslim world see themselves, is actually legacy of, to a large extent, legacy of Western colonialism. Sorry, I'm looking at my presentation. Do you hear me? Do you follow me? I simply don't see. I see only one sister here, Mashita Zazali. So, is everything okay with the presentation?
Thank you.
Yes,
Doctor, I'm following. We're following.
Okay, good.
Yes, we are with you, sir. Everything is okay, sir.
Excellent. Thank you. So let me give you, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. let me just, instead of talking a lot, let me cut this short by showing you some of the pictures which you might have seen. You know, what colonialism meant for Africa, for instance, was 10 to 15 million.
Sorry, you can maximize the PowerPoint slide.
Sorry?
You can maximize the PowerPoint slide by pressing F5. That will give you a better.
At my end, just a second, it says maximized, but let me try.
You can press F5 from your keyboard.
F5. Okay, yeah. Let's try.
It will go in the presentation mode, like it will be on big screen. That is much better.
It's better? Good.
Yeah, it's better. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you. So this is one picture which comes to mind when you mention Western colonialism in Africa. By the way, there was Eastern slave trade route. We are not going to discuss everything in detail. We are talking about Western, which was far more massive than, you know, the Eastern road. That was one. This is, for instance, another image that brings Western colonialism to mind. People were shipped from Africa in a very rational economic way to Central, Southern, and Northern America, stacked like fish, you know, in a can. Or what Spaniards did, according to descriptions by one of them, you know, you can read beneath the picture one description of what Spaniards did to local population, often in the name of Christianity, believing that they are doing some good work for their religion and even for the natives. This is Spaniards, but this is Germans. Okay, you probably follow the news these days that they acknowledged a genocide in Namibia. Of course, we could talk about this politics of this recognition. We have apartheids around us today, but people talk about what happened 100 years ago without willingness to acknowledge what's going on today. But it's another issue. The fact is that almost all European nations committed huge crimes during the colonial era. Some of those amounted to genocide, which is the biggest crime under international law. This is famine in India in late 19th century under British, or a famine in Bengal in 1943. Around 3 million people died because it's now historical fact, not because of lack of water or anything, simply because of the policies that British adopted, securing food for their soldiers and not caring about local population at all. So, and this is French in Algeria. The boxes, skulls you see in the boxes were returned recently from Paris Museum, because these skulls, colonial soldiers, French colonial soldiers, considered to be trophies that were brought to France with them. They brought to France with them, and only recently they were returned to Algeria. Okay, and if you thought, well, there are some nice folks around, Canadians, for instance, where everybody would like to migrate these days, that's not the case. This week and next week, I'm attending a pilgrimage online virtual pilgrimage to native peoples of Northern America. And the horrors you hear about residential schools and attempts by colonials, including churches, both Catholic and Anglican and other Protestant churches, to, civilize native populations resulted in crimes. The discovery of mass grave of 215 children, some of them as young as 3 months, near in the vicinity of the biggest residential school in Canada, which is just a tip of the iceberg. And that similar discoveries prior to this one have forced Canada government to acknowledge colonial genocide over native populations. So this is in very brief, but what matters to us is a related concept, which is decolonization, which is the process by which colonies become independent. Okay, it happened so that, the Second World War actually, among other things, showed the vulnerability of the colonial powers, because the image they were projecting in the colonies was that they were superior, they were untouchable, nobody could do anything to them, I heard from Professor Omar Kasuli, who told us, in Uganda, in the schools, you never heard of battles or wars in which British were defeated, because the policy was they are always victorious and they never get defeated, so don't even try. Now, the Second World War showed that French and British and Dutch could be actually defeated quickly. And for other reasons as well, they lacked both economic power and political support to suppress the revolts around the world. So the decolonization was almost completed in 1970s. Many people will tell you, and UN would acknowledge, that there are still what is in UN called territory, the UN language called territories whose people have not yet attained a full measure of self-government. Gibraltar, French Guyana, this and that. There are 17 such territories recognized by UN as such, but there are also other territories that their peoples, at least some of their people, would consider to still be colonies, but are not recognized as such: Chechnya, Palestine, and others. Again, the basis for decolonization was the recognition of the fundamental right of self-determination that allows not only for independence, political freedom, but also for other ways of decolonization. And this is, I think, where decolonization becomes very interesting for us, especially for the IIIT mission. One dimension of decolonization, if you like, of course, there is political decolonization, there is economic decolonization, and so on. One of those dimensions is colonization and decolonization, right? But we are here talking about decolonization, and I'm going to correct this one. So it's reference to the intellectual decolonization from the colonizers' ideas that made the colonized feel inferior. Now, you're probably familiar with this, but let's just bring this closer to our consciousness. This is an example, and I tell you what this filmmaker from Ethiopia is saying. It describes me reading these and watching these movies around cowboys and Indians and so on. Can you take a moment to read what this filmmaker from Ethiopia has to say about this colonization of the unconscious or subconscious? Please take a minute. As kids, we try to act and so on. Okay, so I don't know whether you read or watched these cowboy movies and whether you took sides and on which side you were, but I can definitely tell you that my generation, we did side with cowboys, unfortunately. So this is cultural decolonization. Now, part of that process is something that we call decolonization of knowledge, sometimes epistemic or epistemological decolonization, which is a concept that critiques the perceived universality of what decolonial scholars call hegemonic Western knowledge system. Okay? Because the way in decades past, we were told that the European political power is superior to anything else. And when it comes to technology, that was true. We are told that, the Western knowledge system is superior. Now, there are people who challenge that. And through decolonization, to this project of decolonization of knowledge, people seek to construct and legitimize other knowledge systems by exploring alternative epistemologies, ontologies, and methodologies. Now, this is your link to your other sessions on Islamization or integration of knowledge, native epistemologies, and so on. Could be native, could be other alternative universal epistemologies. Now, why decolonize knowledge? Okay, knowledge should be knowledge, right? Should be independent of whether it's Western or Eastern or Southern or whatever, European or Asian or whatever. Now, the presumption is, and we are going to come back to this when we talk about modernism and modernity, the presumption is that curricula, theories, and knowledge are colonized, okay? Because how? They are colonized because actually knowledge production is influenced by political, economic, social, and cultural considerations. And I'm sure that most of you are aware of the Edward Said's Orientalism, for instance, his book, in which he deconstructs Western knowledge about Orient. Orientalists try to project the image of passionate seekers of knowledge for the sake of knowledge about the East, about the Eastern men, Oriental men. But then Edward Said showed how actually what they were doing is not knowledge for the sake of knowledge most of the time. It was knowledge that was produced in order to serve powers that be, to make the conquest of the Orient and conquest and control of the Orient easier. Now, related to this concept of cultural colonization or decolonization, and decolonization is neocolonialism, which is the term that refers to continuing dependence of former colonies on foreign countries. Okay? The term now has a pejorative meaning, and it's used to refer to a form of global power in which not just countries, states, but also transnational corporations and global institutions like World Bank or IMF combine to perpetuate colonial forms of exploitation of developing countries. This is just an example. Instead of media on the right, this picture is just an illustration of that position. And instead of media, you could have banks, you could have anything else. I'm sure this is familiar to you. Now, my proposal here is to continue, give you an overview, and then hopefully come for the, for the question and answer session. Or do you have an alternative proposal, Dr. Jamil? Shall we pause for questions and answers here?
Yes, we do have a question and answer session after your presentation, Professor.
Okay, let me then just go quickly of what I have prepared, and then hopefully we will.
Yes, Prof. Please continue. We will have a question floor open later.
Okay, good. So we did imperialism and colonialism. Let's go to modernization. Now, again, a very complex term, but in sociology, it refers to the transformation or transition from a traditional, rural, mainly agrarian society to one that is defined by the rationality, secularity, more focus on these worldly affairs, urban and industrial society. This is, of course, you always have to understand that these are there are nuances to everything that one says. When you say rational, it doesn't mean that traditional societies are completely irrational. Traditions come to be in a very complex way, and they are often there because there is some rationality behind it. But this is, particular form of rationality, individual rationality. Historically, the rise of modern society has been linked with the emergence of industrial society. Okay, because why? Because industrial society implies far more than economic and technological components that make up their core. What we have in mind here is that, the moment industrialization starts, it actually causes a long chain of transformations in a society. Industry requires efficiency, requires repetitions, requires punctuality. When you start the industrial complex, there are series of workers working one after the other. They have to do things on exact time. They have to be organized in shifts. They have to live nearby. They have to, and if there are no enough male workers, you have to reach out to the female workers. That changes the relationships, power relationship, and every other relationship in the family. Of course, industries and factories, they disrupt the traditional, producers, guilds, professional associations. People lose their jobs because there are now cheaper goods. Of course, agriculture is becoming less profitable compared to industrial production, and so on and so forth. So you see a chain of changes in the society. That's why industrialization is so intimately and inextricably related to modernization. This is an illustration of what modernization means. It is, let me just very briefly, the key words that come to mind when we say modernity and modernization are individualism compared to, always emphasis on collective, on community in traditional society, rationalization instead of, this is how we have done things before, so we will keep doing them more or less that way. Science, innovation, new things, we value, modernity values new things, not the older, new things are really the valuable things. Progress is very much the belief that we are going to have a better future if we just follow the scientific and rational ways of doing things. Secularization, focus on this world, we'll come to that. Urbanization, because industries need people. Nation states, because once you have industries, you have huge concentrations of people, you have national education, you can have one language, and then French people can start talking one language and understand each other, and they can communicate, which is another segment or aspect of modernization, more frequently and more intensively among themselves, and their feeling of belonging and separate belonging to a specific nation increases. When the French Revolution happened, this declaration on the rights of citizen and man, the revolutionaries wanted to publish it, and they were told, well, we have to do this in about 100 languages of France. They said, this is crazy, you know. No, we are just going to do it in the Parisian dialect. And this is how modernity creates uniformity, you know, and makes things possible that were previously impossible. Okay, so these are some of the key words that are related to modernity. Now, the best way of explaining modernity is to show what was before and what came after. Okay, now, instead of going to the past, which would be too much to talk about traditional society, let me just focus on something that is called postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Now, despite many achievements, okay, modernity came to be identified with many failures. Some of the key failures, because they happened in Europe, were Holocaust and inequalities on a global scale. Okay, so in Western philosophy, in the second half of the 20th century, a movement often said to have started in 1968. I can tell you a bit about that. I'm sure you heard about it. A movement that was very skeptical of main modernity claims was started. They were suspicious of reason, very sensitive to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. Why 1968? Because this is the time when a generation of young people who were born after the World War II became adults, and they were learning about the atrocities of the Second World War. Germans, French, and so on. And they just started asking their parents, who were supposed to be their authorities, you know, their elders, what did you do? Where have you been when this happened? And of course, many parents couldn't provide satisfactory answers. So you had this, you know, this revolt against the older generation and what they came to represent, which is modernity. So this was like a revolution of a kind in European societies. So postmodernism was a reaction against intellectual assumptions and values of modern period in the history of Western philosophy. Modern period is roughly, you know, and second half of the 18th century, which is Enlightenment, to, you know, mid 20th century. Now, took us too long. I'll send you this presentation so you can have a look at some of these modern assumptions that were questioned by postmodernism. But we are going to do a small exercise now, which I hope you are going to enjoy. Let me just, by way of introduction to that exercise, say the following. Many of the key doctrines of most postmodernism imply some relativism, okay? And I'm sure you have heard of this, and this is a vast, you know, a very rich area of exploration. The key thesis here is that what counts as knowledge in a discipline, in an era, is always influenced by power, okay? You probably hear this. And this is, again, I'm trying to bring up the aspects of this topic that are relevant for your other sessions, which is the issue of knowledge. Now, how? Let me just give you a very minor example of how power influences knowledge. I'm sure you have heard of Maqasid index, Maqasid based index, right? Maqasid development based index, which is a very clever Muslim response to various ways of measuring development. You know, we had methodologies which focused on economic indicators. Then we have Human Development Index. We have Freedom House, you know, measurements and so on. Some people said, okay, why don't we And then, of course, on most of these lists, Muslim countries come, very late down the list. So some people said, okay, why are we accepting these Western European, measurements? Why don't we invent our own methodology, which would comply and, be in line with what we believe in? So some people said, excellent, we have these Maqasid Sharia, accepted pre-modern times and accepted until today. Let's try. And they did. And you know what happened? Again, Muslim countries came low ranking. The top countries, the top Islamic countries, if you like, were Finland, Norway, Singapore. This is embarrassing, right? So what some Muslims did, unfortunately, they produced books on Maqasid-based index, which focus only on the Muslim countries, some Muslim countries. They completely excluded non-Muslim countries. Why? When I confronted some of them, why did they do this? They said some of our sponsors are Muslim governments, which would feel very uncomfortable, supporting projects that actually show that they are less Islamic than Finland or Norway or Sweden or some of these other countries. So this is, you see, where a very simple example of how power considerations influence the kind of knowledge we produce. Now, a very quick comparison. We are not going to do everything. You can have a look at this later. Comparison between modernism and postmodernism. This is not mine, of course. I've lifted it from a YouTube video. I just took a frame. Let me go to number 3. Hard science. People in modernity, people believe that there is truth, that it can be known, and that we can discover it through hard science. There was this unreserved belief in science. Science is good and it's going to do all good. But of course, after the Second World War, after the usage of nukes in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the abuse of medicine during the Nazi era, after the abuses of the chemical industry, both in agriculture and pharmaceuticals, you can't have that trust in science anymore. So that was, for instance, one key difference. For instance, in modernity, there are people who know how to criticize art, there are people who have authority to tell us what is science, what is art, what is good literature, what are good movies. No, in postmodernism, no, anybody is a critique. Anybody can write a review on Amazon on any book, and you get stars, you get stars for what you do. So you see, these are some of the differences. Comparison in architecture, classical architecture that you see in Rome and ancient Greece and so on. Modern is, you see, very functional, everything rectangular, simple. Well, postmodern is a mixture, hybrid. You mix it up the way you like it. Here is a real example, On the left, you have a modern building. Everything is, rational, simple, straight, glass, concrete, and steel. Okay. On the right is a mixture of styles and materials and everything. Okay. Okay, this is another. We are not going to spend too much time on that. Now, final one, secularism. Secularism, like the other concepts we discussed, has many levels of meaning. In sociology, secularization is transformation of a society from close identification with religious values and institutions towards secular, meaning these worldly values and institutions. Okay? In sociology and other social sciences, there was this claim, this thesis belief that as we progress, as societies progress, there will be less and less religion and more rationality in our societies. However, as you know, the late 20th century came up with a surprise that we call sometimes desecularization. This withering away of religion didn't happen. Yeah. On the contrary, we have seen religious fundamentalisms come back with vengeance. And of course, this should not always be identified with religious revival. Some of it is religious revival, but a lot of it is about identity, about ideology, and so on and so forth. Now, just to give you a bit of background, because if you just look at the Muslim history, you can't really understand secularism. You have to go to the European history to be able to understand it. Now, it happened in medieval Europe that people who were really religious, who were concerned with religion, they despised human affairs, these worldly affairs, and they focused on God and afterlife. You know, to the extent that at one point in Protestant Switzerland, 12% of citizens were some sort of priests. Okay, 12%. It's a lot. Okay, it's a lot. And as a reaction to this tendency, during the Renaissance, there were some other people who said this is too much. Okay, we have to focus a bit on human affairs, not just on God. Okay, we have to be anthropocentric, not just theocentric. Yeah. So the process of secularization started, and it meant actually that diminishing of the role of transcendent explanations, both in natural and historical conditions, and the diminishing role of religion in social and societies and cultures. And this is one example. This is from a book by Jared Diamond. I have it here in both, I think this is Malay, right? And English. This show tells you how secularization affects various functions of religion. Look at number one. That's what I want you to focus on 2, 3 of them only, because 7 is too many. Supernatural explanations. What is this? You know, there were times, as you can see, 7,000 years ago, when religious people and religions were actually explaining even what science explains these days, cosmologies and so on. What I'm sure, especially all the participants here, listeners here, you remember when grandmothers and grandfathers used to explain weather conditions or many other things by referring to angels and malaika and so on and so forth. People don't do it often these days, okay? Because for that we have astronomy and geography and other physics and whatever you have. So you see here clearly how secularization has impacted the role of religion in explaining, you know, how the world functions in natural terms. So it used to be everything, and well, in Islam, that was never the case. Like, you know, we never had a situation which was present in Europe in medieval times when church actually had to approve even astronomical explorations or experiments or knowledge. We never had that. So there was not so much pressure to secularize, as we will conclude in the end. Look at another one. Number 3, providing comfort about pain and death. Okay, well, this is strange. It starts very low in the 7,000 years ago. I don't know why he puts it so low. We need to go back to the text. But you see, it's quite high until today. when it comes to pains and death, we still people turn to religion, so much so that, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is this perception that Islamic community, I don't know whether you have it in your countries. I know about the situation in some countries, but Muslims perceive Islamic community, which is Islamic religious organization here, main Islamic organization here, as as a company for burials. That's the main task, because why is this so? Because under number one, medical doctors, medicine can tell you how something happens, how something goes wrong, but it cannot explain why me, why that child, why that person, why not somebody else, that cannot be explained. And medicine doesn't tell you how to deal ultimately with the death, So in this respect, religion wasn't affected very much by secularization. However, when we come to 5 and 6, for instance, which is what people usually have in mind when they talk about secularization, which is political usage or function of religion, obviously in many societies, religion doesn't have as much impact on the social and political affairs as it used to have. And also when it comes to behavior, there is this, probably some of you follow it, Pew Research Center produces often empirical data on religiosity across the Muslim world. And you will be surprised to see how many people still base their behavior on religious teachings, how many of them say disregard it, and how many of them say certain things are not moral issues at all, like, abortus, sexual ethics. They simply say this is not a moral issue. So you see changes there. So I hope this made it a bit more concrete, what secularization means in various aspects of the society. Now, the movement for the secularization has been in progress during the entire course of modern history and has often been viewed as anti-religious. Okay, you see this sign, posts, religion goes one way, politics go the other way. Does it hold true, actually? Is it always as such? Now, there are shades of secularism and secular state, okay? For instance, of course, I am cutting here things short. You can have full theocracy on one end of the spectrum. You can have anti-religious state like we had in Albania, for instance, from 1967 to 1990, where all forms of religion, of course, except communist ideology, were banished. And in the middle, you can have a neutral state which cooperates with religious communities and churches, like in Germany. So you can have, it's a whole continuum and many options there, actually. You would be surprised that many of European countries are actually monarchies which have a state church, whereby the monarch is often both head of state and head of the local church. So the question for us as Muslims here is, can there be too much religion? And as we all know, yes, there can be. That's why we talk about religious extremism, and we were warned by the Prophet that, take it easy, religion, be careful with that. Now, if that is the case, the next question comes is, can there be a healthy dose of secularism? And I think the answer here too is yes. Okay, we all know about the hadith of Antum adra bi umuri dunyakum. You know better your worldly affairs than me. Of course, the question becomes, what is really this world? What is dunya and what is deen, and where do you draw the line? Okay, this is a complex issue, of course. But what we know for sure is that, for instance, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali says, see, and he's not alone in this, of course, he's just mentioning him as a well-known authority. He says, math, medicine, you don't need hadith or ayah for this. 2 + 2 is 4. I mean, nobody is going to cite you ayah for that, which tells you there are areas which are completely independent from revelation, from what? Of course, the application is a different thing, but there we go to ethics, okay? Now, if you go to purpose of Sharia, it tells you that happiness in both worlds is the purpose, not just the hereafter, You see here the difference between what was the background situation for secularism to arise in Europe in the first place and what we have in the Muslim world. And of course, there is this, I want to draw your attention, a very interesting article by Sherman Jackson, American Muslim professor, who talks about Islamic secular, which is the realm between Sharia and hard Sharia, so to say, and godless world, where you act as, which is like purely secular, ultra-secular perception of the world as, where human beings can act as if God didn't exist at all. So he talks about this realm of Islamic secular. It's not hard Sharia, but it's not godless completely. He talks about self-imposed boundaries of Sharia, which makes it much easier for us to accommodate to, these worldly ambitions, dunyawi ambitions of human beings. And I conclude with a citation, with a quotation from very well-known contemporary author on issues secular, Jose Casanova, who says, religions that have always been worldly and lay do not need to undergo a process of secularization. And I see that this very much applies to Islam. So sorry for not being very critical on all of these concepts. Of course, you can abuse any of these concepts, and there needs to be much more balance in representing these concepts than probably you heard from me because of the constraints of time. But at least in the case of secularism, I know that there is a lot of Islamic literature which tells you Islam and secularism face to face, like they can never meet. So I tried here to show that actually there are some things that we can actually learn and benefit from the experience of others with secularism. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't think we have much time, but here I am for whatever questions and comments you have. Thanks a lot. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you very much, Prof.